Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Muhammad Faiqri Muyassar. I am from English Literature, Class B 2019. So this time, I want to explain to you about the 17th century Restoration era English author John Milton. So the first I want to explain to you about the Restoration era. It begins in 1660 until 1688. So, Restoration literature. English literature written after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, following the period of the Commonwealth. Some literary historians speak of the period as bounded by the reign of Charles II, 1660 until 1685, while others prefer to include within the scope the writings produced during the reign of James II, 1685 until 1688. And even literature of the 1960s is often spoken as restoration. By that time, however, the reign of William III and Mary II, 1689 until 1702, had begun, and the ethos of a courtly and urban fashions was a result sober, Protestant, and even pious. In contrast to the sexually and intellectually libertine spirit of court life under Charles II. Many typical literary forms of the modern world, including the novel, biography, history, travel writing, and journalism, gained confidence during the Restoration period, when new scientific discoveries and philosophical concepts as well as new social and economic conditions came into play. There was a great outpouring of pamphlet literature too, much of it politico-religious, while John Bunyan's great allegory, Pilgrim Progress, also belongs to this period. Much of the best poetry, notably that of John Dryden, the great literary figure of his time, in both poetry and prose. The Earl of Rochester, Samuel Butler, and John Oldham was satirical and led directly to the later achievement of Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift, and John Gay in the Augustan Age. The Restoration period was, above all, a great age of drama, heroic plays, influenced by principles of French neoclassicism. Enjoy evolved, but the age is chiefly remembered for its glittering, critical comedies of manners by such playwrights as George Etheredge, William Wycherley, Sir John Vanbrugh, and William Congreve. And the next is there is 4 points I want to explain. The first one is biography, the second one is major works, the third is selected works, the fourth is conclusion. We're going to the first point, biography of John Milton. John Milton, the English poet and controversialist, is born in 1608 and died in 1674, was a champion of liberty and of love-centered marriage. He is chiefly famous for his epic poem Paradise Lost and for his defense of uncensored publication. The lifetime of John Milton spanned an age of sophistication, controversy, dynamism, and revolution. When he was born, England was illuminated by the versatile genius of Francis Bacon, William Shakespeare, William Byrd, Orlando Gibbons, and Irigo Jones. Christopher Wren was at the height of his power when Milton died in 1674. At that date, Henry Purcell was the major composer. Isaac Newton dominated in mathematics and physics, and literature enjoyed the varied talents of John Dryden, Andrew Marvell, John Bunyan, and Samuel Pepys. In the middle period of Milton's life, England, after two revolutionary wars, became a republic and then a protectorate under Oliver Cromwell. When monarchy and the Anglican Church were restored in 1660, mercantilist capitalism had been firmly established and the foundation of the British Empire and Navy were laid. The background, life, and education. The poet's father, John Milton, Sir, emerged from a line of obscure Roman Catholic yeomen in Oxfordshire, was educated as a chorister, went to London, and became a scrivener. a profession that combined moneylender, copyist, notary, and contract lawyer. About 1600, he married Sarah Jeffrey, the wealthy daughter of a merchant tailor. Three of their children survived infancy: Anne, John, born on December 9, 1608, and Christopher. Their father was not only an able man of business but a musician. He composed madrigals, choral pieces, and some hymns that are still sung. From him young John derived the love of music that pervaded his work. According to Milton's own account in his second defense, 1654, my father destined me while still a child for the study of human letters, which I took up so eagerly that from the age of 12 on, I hardly ever took to bed from my intense studies before midnight. After private tutoring about 1620, he entered St. Paul's schools, where he studied Sallust, Virgil, and Horace and the New Testament in Greek. Back at Cambridge, about April 1626, Milton was assigned a different tutor and resumed the study of logic, ethics, Greeks, Latin, and Hebrew. He composed Latin poems on the death of prominent men, some antipopist epigrams, and in Quintum Novembris, on the 5th of November, a melodramatic title epic on the gunpowder plot. In 1628, his first major English poem, on the death of a fair infant dying of the cough, was occasioned by the death of his sister baby. A year later, in Image of Light and Music, on the morning of Christ's Nativity, celebrate the harmonizing power of divine love. Crucial decades 1640 until 1660. It was by writing prose that Milton found opportunities to serve his God and country. In 1641 until 1642, he pours out tracts opposing the bishops' control of religion. In his judgment, their powers were based on man-made tradition, self-interest, and a combination of ignorance, superstition, and deliberate falsification. In 1644, Milton's of Education dealt with another kind of domestic freedom, how to develop in schoolboys discipline, reasonableness, broad culture, all-around ability, and independence of judgment. The same year saw Aeropagitica, his defense of men's right to free speech and discussion as the best means of advancing truth. To this end, he opposed pre-publication censorship, though admitting that if a book or those responsible for it broke clear and reasonable law against libel, pornography, blasphemy, or sedition, the work could be repressed or those responsible for it could be fairly tried and punished if found guilty. The divorce track made Milton undeservedly notorious as a fanatic libertine advocate of free love. Leaders of his collected poems, 1645, were therefore probably surprised to find the charming seriousness of an author who, had he died then, might have been ranked with George Herbert and Robert Herrick as an Anglican poet. For some years, Milton had been losing his eyesight, and by early 1652 he was totally blind, reflecting that this could be prevent the use of his talent in God's service. He composed the sonnet "When I Consider How My Life Is Spent," with its famous conclusion, "They also serve who only stand and wait." In 1656, 4 years after his first wife died, Milton married Catherine Woodcock. 2 years later, she died as a result of childbirth, and he tenderly memorialized her in a sonnet, "To My Late Departed Saint." Despite adversity, Milton heroically persists during the crisis preceding restoration of the monarchy. He dictated several tracts. In a treatise of civil power, 1659, he again urged toleration and separation of church and state. Ready and Easy Way, 1660, argued for preservation of a republic. A brief sound entry for the beginners in Douglas Bose. For the reading of John Milton. The best treatment of Milton's prose in its intellectual context is Milton and the Puritan Dilemma by Arthur E. Barker in 1756. He edited Milton, Modern Essays in Criticism, in, in 1965, an excellent introduction to 20th century approach to the poetry, with guidance for further reading. Milton Epic Poetry, edited by C.A. Patridis in 1967, contains a variety of essays and an annotated reading list. And the next is the major works of John Milton. There is 4 major works of John Milton. The first one is Paradise Lost. The second one is Paradise Regained. The third is L'Allegro. The fourth is Il Penseroso. Major works of John Milton. John Milton was a 17th century English poet whose work have greatly influenced the literary world. Milton wrote poetry and prose between 1632 and 1674, and is most famous for his epic poetry. Special collections and archives hold a variety of Milton's major works, including Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, L'Allegro, and Il Penseroso. Paradise Lost is one of the most recognized works in actual English literature. The first version, published in 1667, contained 10 books. A later edition was published in 1674, which consists of 12 books. Paradise Lost consists of more than 1,000 lines of verse. It tells the story of Adam and Eve, including their creation, inability to resist the temptation of Satan, and subsequent fall from grace. Special collections and archives hold several editions of Paradise Lost, including one that was published in 1818. This edition was published by Benjamin Warner, Quaker bookseller from Philadelphia. Another famous work by Milton is Paradise Regained. First published in 1671, Special Collection and Archives hold a 1790 edition titled Paradise Regained, a poem in 4 parts by John Milton from the text of Dr. Newton. This edition was published by William Young, a bookseller, printer, and publisher who had printing business at his Philadelphia home. Milton's Paradise Regained is a philosophical dialogue between Satan and the Son of God. The Son of God attributes for noble consciousness and internal quality conversely. Satan believes that it is acceptable to pursue external values such as power, wealth, and recognition. Milton's L'Allegro and Il Penseroso is another important work by Milton, held in special collection and archives. This edition was published in 1855 in London by David Bogue, Miles Birkett Foster, a famous illustrator, watercolor artist, and engraver in the 19th century. Milton was in his 20s when he wrote L'Allegro and Il Penseroso, a young poet questioning what it meant to be an epic poet. As he matured, this early work had a major influence on his later writing. As he grew older, his poems became more complex and insightful. By the time he wrote Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, Milton was blind. Although he had lost his sight, he utilized what he called divinest melancholy to compose his most powerful works. And the next explanation is about the selected work of John Milton. So I choose Sonnet 19 when I consider how my life is spent in the selected work of John Milton. In the first explanation about the selected work of John Milton, there is a title of poem. Sonnet 19, more commonly called When I Consider How My Life is Spent, is a poem by the English poet John Milton, likely written in the mid-1650s after Milton lost his eyesight. The poem reflects on the physical and spiritual challenge the speaker faces as a blind person. He feels unable to complete the task that God has set for him, and worries that he is squandering his capacities to serve God. But in the second half of the poem, the speaker reassures himself by arguing that God does not need human help, and that there are many ways to serve him. Like some of Milton's other poems, for example, How Soon Had Time, the poem thus defends a Protestant position, the idea that salvation comes from the faith rather than the work. And the next explanation is about the theme. In When I Consider How Malek Spends, Milton reflects on blindness. This was an important topic for him. As he lost his sight in the mid-1650s, Milton was a writer and translator, someone he trusts in his eyes. However, although blindness presents some practical problem, in this poem Milton focused on the spiritual problems associated with blindness. The speaker of the poem believes he should use technique writing in the service of God. Yet the blindness of the speaker made this impossible. This implicitly raised questions about the demands God placed on man, but all tensions are resolved by the end of the sonnet. The last speaker asserts that man is better at serving God by faith instead of work. In the first 8 lines of the poem, the speaker mourns the loss of his sight. Because of this blindness, the speaker feels unable to complete the work he intended to do and what God expects the speaker to do. Referring to the allegory of talents in Matthew, the speaker argues that if God gives someone a skill or ability, God expects them to use it wisely, profit. If they do not, they will suffer the wrath of God. But the speaker's blindness prevents them from pursuing a literary career, even if the speaker had undertaken it specifically to glorify God. So boiling under the first 8 lines of the poem is an unrelenting torment, a feeling that heaven may have been unjust. Once the speaker expressed frustration at being blind and engaged in a dangerous, almost blasphemous argument with God, a new voice enters the poem, which the speaker calls Evans, ring. This allegorical figures promotes two arguments. First, this number notes that God does not require man's labor or his gifts. Instead, the best way to ensure salvation is simply to obey God. So, doing great works is perfectly acceptable to God, Milton, but it is not the only way to please Him. Just waiting for God's commandments, perhaps forever, is just as effective. Action is not important. What matters is how it is done and whether it is an expression of faith in God and God's will. The next explanation is about imagery. Darkness is the opposite of light. When speaker refers to this issue in line 2, they think about the challenge they face as a blind person. The world literally turns dark for the speaker, turning even places, the most familiar points and activities into dangerous challenge. In a world built for those who can see, speaker must now find a way to survive. But like the light in the previous line, the word also has a symbolic meaning. It symbolizes sin and the absence of God. When the speaker notes that his light is spent in the first line of the poem, the speaker literally has lost his sight. Hence the poem's alternate title, On His Blindness. This literal meaning perhaps the crux of the poem. The next explanation about figurative language. There is alliteration figurative language. When I consider how Malek is penned, begins with religion suspicion, which express Puritan's religion's doctrine with considerable confidence. Puritan did more than just have a strong feeling about issues such as the relationship between faith and work. They also had strict standards for the appearance of the church. They preferred a bare plain space for their worship. During the English Civil War, they destroyed many of the stained glass and icons that survived the Middle Ages. In other words, their position was aesthetic as it was religious, a devout Puritan and poet. Milton finds himself in a difficult position. His art relies on decorative literary means, but those same means can look overly decorative, which contradicts the simple aesthetics he preferred in religious affairs. I am. Therefore, the alliteration of poetry is quite sparse. Speakers are not interested in hiding their fears. Instead, the speakers present them clearly and directly. However, there are important moments in alliteration. For example, prevent the repeating sounds D and W of day. This dark word and white on the second line, or the P sound of patience on the 8th line. There is a rhyme. The explanation of the rhyme, when I consider how my life is spent, is a Petrarca sonnet and follows the standard Petrarca rhyme scheme. The hymns can be divided into two parts. In the first 8 lines of poem, the speaker uses only two rhymes, ent and id. This relentlessly revolves around these two sounds, making these lines feel distorted. In this way, they mimic the fear, they explain the speaker's fear, and he no longer meets God's expectation because he is blind. Like horror, these lines do not move forward to discover new things. Instead, they always come back to themselves. Therefore, the last 6 lines of this poem seems almost reassuring by introducing three new rhymes in the 6 lines: EED, EST, and EAT. Therefore, the complete rhyme seams of the poem is A, B, B, A, B, B, A, C, D, E, C, D, E. This is the standard rhyme seams for Petrarchan sonnets. The new rhymes that appear in the last line of the poem mimic the extended sense of the possibilities and fear liberation that the speaker described in these lines. The sound of the poem gives Milton the taste of freedom he needs. Give the reader the Christian faith. And it is the poem of John Milton, Sonnet 19, when I consider how my life is spent. And the next is the conclusion of the explanation. When John Milton thinks about when I consider how my life is spent, it is a survey of the moral dilemma that John Milton faced when he was forced to agree with blindness and was conveyed through a spokesperson. Milton's spokesman faced the inability to continue his work. Works that are often equated with Milton, writing or those that do not serve God because his blindness. He cannot continue as before and he asks and receives answer to his inner question. When thinking about his blindness, Sonnet 19, when I consider how my life is spent, it was written before 1664, after the poet John Milton became completely blind. As it is sometimes called, it is a belief sonnet. The syntax of poetry is very complex, especially when compared to modern poetry. Milton used words like Job and write his lines in literary sense like fainting. So I think that is my explanation. Thank you for your attention and participation, and see you.